My name is Garrett Plower. I am the supervisor and park ranger here at the house, and so I was very excited when Rob and I were just talking about something earlier this year. I don't know. He said he was going to be in the area. So I'm like, oh, well, you have to come and talk at the house. We're always happy to have Rob back. I'm sure a lot of you know Rob and have been, or if you don't know him personally, you've been to one of his programs or talks here at the house. Comes a lot. Spent years working here before me. I don't know, 7 years. That was a long time, but he certainly was a big part of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, eventually family, and so we're always very excited to have happy to have him back. So join me in welcoming Rob Velella back.
I can't see the screen from here, so if I start talking about something that doesn't line up with what's on the screen, just wave at me. So I'm calling my talk $Longfellow, How Poe Became a Millionaire. The research that I'm presenting today is heavily informed by the work of a historian named William Charbat, so I've got to acknowledge him. He really pioneered the subject of what we now call the history of the book. In a way, we look at the history of texts without looking at the texts themselves. So it's context without text. So you'll find I'm talking around Longfellow's poetry a lot, without really talking about Longfellow's poetry. I suppose, I should also point out too, a version of this research was printed in a book called Reconsidering Longfellow, edited by Christoph Irmscher and Robert Arbor in 2014. It is now available in paperback. Reconsidering Longfellow, I'm assuming you're all writing this down. It sold at least 12 copies, which is why it's now in paperback. But for me, the real beginning of this research started in about 2007, 2008, before I had ever visited the Longfellow House in Cambridge. I was in Philadelphia, a graduate student studying publishing, and on the side, I volunteered at the home of my favorite author, Edgar Allan Poe. The Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site is one of only a handful of National Park Service units dedicated to interpreting American writers, just like this house. The brick row home is kept in preserved ruin. There are no artifacts other than the house itself. It's located in the Spring Garden neighborhood of Philadelphia. You know that area. It's near the Poe Projects, a Section 8 housing project, a not-so-great area of town. Visitors had to knock on the door in order to be admitted because we would not keep the door unlocked. We would often warn tourists who called to ignore the map. It's not a place you want to walk to from the Liberty Bell or Independence Hall. And if you do drive, make sure you lock your car. Keep your valuables out of sight. After giving up pretty much every weekend and a couple of weekdays for over a year, to guiding tourists through Poe's home, I came here to Cambridge to work at Henry Longfellow's mansion, a place so big they used to call it Craigie Castle. Right away I had a question in my mind. How? Poe and Longfellow were born only a couple of years apart, but only one met with financial success. So to answer my own question, I started looking at what Longfellow left behind. His record books, his ledgers, contracts with publishers, and various other financial papers, either here at the archives at the Longfellow House or at Harvard's Houghton Library. But more than just making money, the story of Longfellow's financial success is about his personality, his good luck, his intentions, his professional goals. So let's start at the beginning of Longfellow's story. Young Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published his first poem, The Battle of Lovell's Pond, in the November 17, 1820 issue of the Portland Gazette. He was 13 years old. He was not swayed by his first critic, who said that it was remarkably stiff. When he was in college, I think this is the peak of his ambition, when he writes this bombshell confession to his father. This is his senior year at Bowdoin College. I will not disguise it in the least. The fact is, I most eagerly aspire after future eminence in literature. My whole soul burns most ardently after it, and every earthly thought centers in it. I am almost confident in believing that if I can ever rise in the world, it must be by the exercise of my talents in the wide field of literature. This is important to me, because this was a teenage Longfellow who was already setting his professional goals. But even though he published some 40 minor poems while a student, his ambitions were pretty ridiculous. The reality is, as Longfellow is making this statement, authorship as a profession in the United States did not exist. Even the earliest of acknowledged American writers, Washington Irving, worked a variety of jobs before relying on books for income. Irving served as a lawyer, an aide-de-camp, a business partner in a mercantile firm, secretary for an overseas legation, minister to Spain. Meanwhile, Irving complained if the American public wished to have a literature of their own, they must consent to pay for the support of authors. Irving published his Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon in 1819, shortly before Longfellow published his first juvenile poem. And it was one of the first works by an American author to receive significant public attention. Irving's book was published first in England to secure copyright overseas, before being immediately published in the United States with a domestic copyright. Both editions earned him some $5,000 in that year. It was Irving's sketchbook, the collection that included Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, that put Longfellow on his literary path. It's because of Irving that Longfellow has his ambitions. As Longfellow later recalled, every reader has his first book. Yeah, I'll show you. Every reader has his first book. I mean to say, one book among all others which in early youth first fascinates his imagination and at once excites and satisfies the desires of his mind. To me, this first book was the Sketchbook of Washington Irving. I was a schoolboy when it was published, and read each succeeding number with ever-increasing wonder and delight, spellbound by its pleasant humor, its melancholy tenderness, its atmosphere of reverie. Whenever I open its pages, I open also that mysterious door which leads me back into the haunted chambers of my youth. But remember that Irving published his book concurrently on 2 continents because of the lack of international copyright law. Though copyright law was suggested as early as 1783, by the early 19th century, even domestic copyright laws barely existed and were rarely enforced. The most important point of this was that British works could be legally reprinted without permission. American publishers saved money by not having to pay stipends or royalties to the British authors, like Walter Scott, Lord Byron, and Charles Dickens. Readers were happy about it because a legitimate book published in England commanded a cover price of $7.30, but a pirate edition in the US was $2. As Edgar Allan Poe once wrote in a letter to William Cullen Bryant, without an international copyright law, American authors may as well cut their throats. Longfellow knew of this problem too. Years later, he would plead with his friend, United States Senator Charles Sumner, to introduce a bill for international copyright protection. He noted it would save authors an immense deal of trouble. Kind of difference how Poe and Longfellow talk about these things. But the other problem was the lack of a true national literary canon. When Longfellow graduated from Bowdoin College, he gave a speech focused on the idea of American authorship. Quote, "As yet we can boast of nothing farther than a first beginning of a national literature." The major cause, the young Longfellow surmised, was the inability to devote what he calls exclusive attention to the profession of writing. One who would truly create a national literature, he says, must have, quote, "an utter abandonment of everything else." So Longfellow's predicting that eventually an American author will need to use authorship as a sole profession rather than as a hobby on the side in order to produce quality literature. Well, Longfellow was offered a job teaching at his alma mater, Bowdoin, but only if he got further language studies in Europe. His father covered the expenses for his travels, and in the course of 3 years, he racked up a surprisingly modest bill of $2,604. He would remain relatively frugal. I know it's really hard to say this if you've toured this house. Longfellow remains relatively frugal for most of his life. On the other hand, like a typical Yankee, Longfellow wants to maximize his income. One of the most important, yet most forgotten details about Longfellow's first job out of college is that he originally turned it down. And I haven't seen this mentioned in any of the biographies of Longfellow. On August 27, 1829, he wrote to the president of Bowdoin College, "Your letter, enclosing a copy of the vote of the trustees and overseers of Bowdoin College, by which they have elected me instructor of the modern languages in that institution, has been duly handed me. The professorship of I am sorry that under existing circumstances I cannot accept the appointment. The professorship of modern languages, with a salary equal to that of the other professors, would certainly not have been refused. But having at great expense devoted 4 years to the acquisition of the French, Spanish, Italian, and German languages, I cannot accept a subordinate station with a salary so disproportionate to the duties required." They offered him $600 and a relatively low-ranking title. Longfellow turns it down, August 27, 1829. And this letter should really impress you when I tell you this. According to Bowdoin College records, Longfellow wrote this letter a week before classes started. So you can imagine the folks at Bowdoin are a little concerned. Longfellow's put them in a tough position, potentially leaving them understaffed just before the semester began. I think this was intentional. I think it was a ploy specifically to get more money. And it worked. Only a couple of days later, Longfellow accepted the position with an upgraded title, Professor of Modern Languages at Bowdoin, quote, with the understanding that his salary would eventually be raised to match the title. His compensation was $800 a year, with an additional $100 for serving as a part-time librarian, a job which required only 1 hour of work every day. The point of this story is that even as a young man, in the first ever job that he ever held, he is able to orchestrate his own financial success. But I want to put it in perspective, too. That same year, Longfellow's future friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson, earned $1,400 as a preacher in Boston. Longfellow was earning about 64% of what Emerson did. So Longfellow's salary isn't great. It's the equivalent of just over $20,000 a year. So as a college graduate, it's not exciting. But Longfellow immediately began writing and translating language textbooks with the intention of having some additional money on the side. I won't get into too many details, but his experience with his first book, a translation of elements of French grammar, was important to his development as an author. He scrutinized every detail of its publication, including the binding, paper, the expense to produce it. He took great care to ensure its quality, but he wanted to make sure it was affordable to his readers. He also learned about the difficulty working with publishers who did not necessarily support his work or get excited by his projects. And he also self-financed this book, a process he immediately came to hate. Quote, "Woe is me, I shall never save," meaning I shall never recover, "the expense of printing." But he sent copies of this first book to the librarian at Harvard College in June of 1830, possibly ingratiating himself for a possible future job there. Longfellow translated similar textbooks on other languages, including a textbook to learn, oh, that's his salary at Bowdoin, I didn't get to that one. Here it is. In addition to his first book, he's translating other books. This one is one for people who wanted to learn French, I think, by already learning a little Italian. There are a number of these kinds of language textbooks that he's writing, and these are his first books. So he's getting a lot of experience even before he's really publishing any of the poetry you know about. What's interesting about these textbooks, too, is he's using different publishers. He doesn't stick to a single one. He's kind of shopping around a little bit. At one point, he works with a Boston publisher in 1833 named William Tickner. We'll get back to him. I'm glad you know that name. That's so exciting to me. With these early publications, Longfellow learned a great deal about the publishing industry. Enough that he warned his friend George Washington Green, quote, "If your object is to gain money, let me advise you not to publish a book on your own accord, on your own account." Instead, he advises finding a bookseller to cover the costs of a first edition. So Longfellow predicts an author's success must come from a publisher paying the full costs of publishing his books. In 1835, Harper's published his book Outre-mer, a collection of sketches relating to his travels to Europe. Its sales were dismal, and its lack of critical success dissuaded Longfellow from pursuing creative writing for a time. Harper's, the New York-based publisher, typically paid using the half-profits system. So they covered the cost of manufacturing, but did not give any money to the author until their investment was returned by profits. In 1838, Longfellow published a novel, Hyperion, a romance, with its initial costs likely subsidized by the printer. The semi-autobiographical book earned Longfellow a modest $375. But it should sound to you like Longfellow's on track here. Then the publisher, Samuel Coleman, suddenly went out of business, and half of Longfellow's books' print run was seized for his creditors. But remember that books were not Longfellow's main source of income. We're not there yet. So long as he was teaching. Still, he began to dislike the quiet life of Brunswick, Maine, teaching at Bowdoin. He briefly considered a professorship in New York, until he found out that it was unpaid. Quote, "I have aimed higher than this." Luckily, he had been corresponding for years with George Ticknor, a language professor at Harvard. And George Ticknor put Longfellow's name as a successor upon his retirement. The college's president, Josiah Quincy, contacted the 27-year-old Longfellow directly and offered him the job with an annual salary of $1,500. That's a big leap from the original $600 that Bowdoin offered him a few years earlier. Well, Longfellow took the job. After selling all of his furniture, he took a trip to Europe to further study German. During the trip, his young wife, Mary Storer Potter, died. Many of you know this story. Shortly after that, he met Frances, or Fanny Appleton, of Boston, while they were both traveling in Switzerland. He returned to the United States, Longfellow did, and he took up his Smith professorship at Harvard in 1836. 4 years later, Longfellow recorded his salary as $1,500 plus $300 for extra from college, possibly to cover his college-related expenses. We know that he was buying books for the library, for example. That salary without the extra is equal to about $41,000 today. Not bad, he's doing pretty well. He knew that he was worth it. He did not let the college take advantage of him. When asked to fill in to teach another class, for example, he asked for the extra money. "I'll teach another class, but only if you pay me extra." By 1852, his regular salary, however, had only been raised to $1,800. So that's only a $300 increase from when he started 16 years earlier. It was while working at Harvard and living at the Craigie House that Longfellow published his first book of poems, Voices of Night, in 1839. The book, and Longfellow's time in the Craigie House, according to one scholar, marked, quote, "the real beginning in Longfellow's literary career." From then on, Longfellow was, first and foremost, a poet, not a textbook author, not a travel essayist, not a novelist, despite his early attempts at each. You're seeing he's trying whatever he can. In 1840, Longfellow's income from writing was $219. That came mostly from individually published poems that were printed here and there in different newspapers, magazines, and so forth. For comparison, the now forgotten writer Nathaniel Parker Willis, that same year, earned $4,800 from writing. You've heard of N.P. Willis? Yes.
Fanny Fern's brother.
That's right, Fanny Fern's brother. In some years, N.P. Willis said that number was doubled. Longfellow once lamented, quote, that Willis says he has made $10,000 the last year by his writings. I wish I had made 1,000. I'd like to suspect that Longfellow consulted with N.P. Willis early in his own career about how to increase sales. We have a very mysterious portrait of N.P. Willis in the house here, and there's not really a lot of backstory about why it's here or why Longfellow would be close enough with Willis at the time that that portrait would have been done. But I suspect Longfellow knew this is the guy that knows how to make money. Let's see what he has to say, and a friendship formed. if this really did happen, if Longfellow did approach Willis, I would guess that Willis emphasized a need to appeal to a mass audience rather than critical tastes. That was Willis's own method. Willis also kind of creates a public persona that's appropriate for public consumption in a lot of ways, which I think Longfellow will do too. But this is the period when Longfellow published a poem here and there in magazines, earning between $15, maybe $20 each. His famous poem, The Village Blacksmith, for example, was sold to the New York Knickerbocker in late 1840 for $15. It's the equivalent of about $400 today. He was building a national reputation, though, enough that the first major survey-style collection of American poetry, The Poets and Poetry of America, included Longfellow on its frontispiece as one of the top 5 American poets. I always talk about this man because he's so important to me. The book's editor, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, put Longfellow's image in the bottom right here, alongside some of the heavy hitters of the day, like William Cullen Bryant and other names that are less impressive to us now. This anthology was massively successful. It sold out 3 editions in only 6 months, and Longfellow's on the frontispiece. That book's editor, Rufus Griswold, gave Longfellow his first big break. It was Griswold who bought Longfellow's play in verse, The Spanish Student, for Graham's magazine. Griswold was editing Graham's at the time. The Spanish Student was published in 1842. Longfellow was given $150 for that one piece. Remember a few years earlier he made $219 an entire year for his writing? One piece, $150. It also exposed him to a huge audience. The magazine was one of the most successful in the United States. It issued something like 40,000 copies to subscribers that year. 40,000 copies. Griswold asked for more contributions from Longfellow, and instead of his usual $15, Longfellow was paid $50 each for poems like Nuremberg, The Arsenal at Springfield, and Childhood. That's equal to about $1,100 each today. Longfellow collected some of these poems and published Voices of the Night and Ballads and Other Poems. He earned 10 cents in royalty payments for each copy sold. But Longfellow demanded of his publisher that any edition of his books consist of at least 500 copies. He said nothing less than 500 copies. That automatically guarantees at least a respectable print run. Griswold also hooked Longfellow up with a commission to produce an anthology of European poets. That anthology earned Longfellow $1,000. That's more than half of his annual salary at Harvard, although it took Longfellow a few years to do it. It's called The Poets and Poetry of Europe, if you're curious. But a very important other factor that has to come up here, we can't neglect this. Longfellow married Fanny Appleton in this period, and her father purchased this house for them in 1843. Longfellow is now the owner, or at least his family owns, a $10,000 home. The 35-year-old Longfellow did not have to pay rent, like many other still struggling authors. For example, Nathaniel Hawthorne did not own a home until 1853, when he was then 49 years old. Longfellow's home was valued at $1,500. 15% of the value of, this is Hawthorne's house, was valued at $1,500, which is 15% of the value of Longfellow's home. So I want you to see the disparity of their income. Fanny also earned income from her father's investments in her name, amounting to about $1,700 to $1,900 in interest per year. But I want to be clear, it's unfair to say that Longfellow relied on his wife's family's wealth. In the first 10 years of marriage, only once was her income greater than his income from teaching and writing. And of course, Longfellow was always looking to make more money. And I think home ownership made Longfellow a bit more daring, maybe even aggressive in his publishing projects. He could now dictate terms to his publisher. If he didn't like an agreement, he could safely walk away. He didn't immediately need the money, like, say, Edgar Allan Poe did. A man who basically lived hand to mouth in this period and accepted just about any offer that any publisher ever offered. And I want to show you how daring it is. Longfellow ditched his publisher, John Owen, the guy with whom he had made the deal to publish at least 500 copies. he started looking into the Boston publishing house owned by William Ticknor, remember him? And James T. Fields, best known as Ticknor and Fields. You might know their home base in Boston, the old corner bookstore. In June 1846, Longfellow noted in his journal, "Passed an hour talking to Ticknor about publishing my books." Longfellow drove a hard bargain with Ticknor and Company and turned down their first offer. "I confess that," he writes, "I cannot bring myself to be satisfied with it. I really do not think you offer enough." Noting that William Cullen Bryant was paid 25 cents per copy by his publisher, Harper's in New York, Longfellow proposed 22.5 cents for himself. Ticknor counteroffered, and Longfellow accepted 20 cents per copy sold, which is still double his previous deal with John Owen. Things really changed in 1845, and I'll give you this shot of Longfellow here. Longfellow has these notes in his count books in that year, 1845, noting that most of his works were still in print. 10th edition of Voices of the Night, an 8th for ballads and other poems, a 2nd and 3rd for his novel Hyperion, for example. But that year, he asked for the stereotype plates to be turned over to him instead of being given his regular payment. So he's now the owner of his stereotype plates. And as the owner, he is the only person who can say when his books get printed. This really ensures a high return on investment for Longfellow. He could lease these plates out for the use of printers, allowing for quick and inexpensive reprints if they were successful, but those reprints could only be done with his permission. Prior to this, a lot of publishers would just hit a 2nd or 3rd edition without telling the author or giving them the payment that may have been owed them because it wasn't in their contract. Ordering plates implied the book was expected to have longevity. The expense was not justified unless it could be used to print several editions. So Longfellow is sort of implying, I want lots of editions. Some historians have estimated that this practice nearly doubles Longfellow's returns and more importantly protects him from the whims and dishonesty of publishers. Longfellow was innovating something new, something unusual. In 1856, for example, only 23 printings of works were produced by Ticknor and Fields from plates belonging to the author. So only 23. Longfellow is one of them, and it certainly works for him. As early as 1848, Ticknor and Fields reported that stores could buy Longfellow books at a lower bulk rate, making him more profitable for those booksellers. So this is a good deal. And I want to emphasize again that Longfellow was beating a difficult system. Longfellow's neighbor, colleague, and friend, James Russell Lowell, is a good comparison. Canterburyans know Lowell, right? Lowell, most people don't remember, was plagued by financial difficulties for much of his career. In 1870 to 1871, he was so desperate for income, he started selling off most of his land around the family's Elmwood estate, just down the road, it's down this way here, until only 2.5 acres remained. For a long period, Lowell's main source of income was selling land he could no longer afford to take care of. And Lowell, in case you don't know him, is extremely comparable to Longfellow because he was also a Harvard language professor and a writer, a poet, living in Cambridge. Lowell will never have the selling power that Longfellow does. In fact, I would argue no one will ever have the selling power Longfellow does. Even when Lowell purchased his own stereotype plates that he used to publish his works, he netted only 10 to 12% of royalties at a time when Longfellow was earning double that. Working with Ticknor and Fields was another landmark point for Longfellow's career. In a way, their company ended regional publishing and created a national publishing house. This is a new thing. Boston was growing and benefiting from new railways that allowed it to compete with cities with rivers that could take their goods to the interior of the country. Theirs, Ticknor and Fields, was the first company to offer royalties to an American writer. Specifically, that first royalty payment was given to a friend of Longfellow's named John Greenleaf Whittier, who earned 10 cents per copy sold of his book, Lays of My Home. In 1856, the average royalty that the company paid was 10 cents per copy sold. However, When Evangeline was published in 1847, Longfellow was paid much more. He received over 25 cents for each copy sold, believed to be the highest royalty for any American poet by that time. That book, by the way, Evangeline, sold 36,000 copies within 10 years. By 1857, the poem had earned Longfellow at least $9,000, equal to over $240,000 today. In a way, these 10 years between the publication of Evangeline and that final figure I gave you, these 10 years are probably the most important in analyzing Longfellow's poetic money-making, which should be a real term, by the way. This was a time when American writing was suddenly bursting forward. Some have called it the American Renaissance. It was the period, for example, when Hawthorne published The Scarlet Letter, a book which earned its author only $1,500 total in his lifetime, ever. But the next year was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which earned the author $10,300 in its first 3 months after publication as a book in 1852. Reportedly, it sold over 5 million copies in the U.S. In the decade of the 1850s, American publishing grew from an industry worth $4.5 million to an industry worth $12.5 million. Remember that Longfellow predicted the only way to really improve American writing was if an author could devote himself fully to writing. In 1854, he quit his job at Harvard, making writing his only source of income. He was 47 years old and never worked another job the rest of his life. He's now acknowledged as America's first professional poet. In a few private letters, he says his motivation was to avoid the routine of doing the same thing over and over again for many years. That his duties left him, quote, no time for poetry and left him unproductive. This was risky in 1854. Longfellow had 4, soon to be 5 children to support by then, even though he himself admitted he was not, quote, very sure about his prospects for success. I think he knew what he was doing. Look at the direct trajectory of his financial success in those previous years. Evangeline earned $9,000 in 10 years. Kavanaugh in 1849 earned him $825 in 1 year. The Golden Legend earned him $1,357.70 in 1 year. At a time, remember, when his full-time job earned him $1,800 a year. One book earned him over $1,300. Then, in November 1855, he published the first book since quitting Harvard. It's called The Song of Hiawatha by Ticknor and Fields. Longfellow was paid $1,000, and 90% of the first edition sold in its first day. 11,000 copies were sold by the end of the year. The year after that, the poet estimated that 50,000 copies had sold. Longfellow's success continued with The Courtship of Miles Standish, which sold 25,000 copies in 2 months. Another 10,000 in London on its first day there. Between 1840 and 1859, Longfellow was the most popular author published by Ticknor and Fields, selling 165,736 copies of 15 titles in that period. That culminated with the publication of his most enduring poem, Paul Revere's Ride, in late 1860, later collected in Tales of a Wayside Inn in 1863. By 1868, Longfellow's annual income was over $48,000. That's over $800,000 today. He's not working a full-time job. By 1865, he no longer worried about his personal investments. Ticknor and Fields was fully covering the costs of stereotyping, and they kept him loyal with generous payments and royalties. Hiawatha, Miles Standish, Paul Revere's Ride, Wayside Inn, hopefully you recognize most of these titles. I like to call this Longfellow's middle period, a time when he was extremely aware of the broader trends in literature. It was in this period that American writers were collectively trying to tell distinctly American stories to set them apart from their European colleagues. Longfellow joined in on this movement for distinctly American stories, and this should be pretty obvious from these options here. Most of his most memorable writings have roots in American history or American folklore. We have to be aware then that he was purposefully appealing to vast audiences, like N.P. Willis may have recommended, in the hopes of earning significant income. To accomplish this, Longfellow avoided controversy. In the first edition of his complete works, published by Carey and Hart, mid-career in 1845, Longfellow purposely excluded his earlier anti-slavery poems, which I think was because he didn't want to offend potential readers. The result here is a broad audience of people, from all walks of life, different educational backgrounds, and he became so popular that he also became untouchable. In fact, few critics dared to write negatively about him. As Bliss Perry later noted, saying something bad about Longfellow was as inadmissible as, quote, carrying a rifle into a national park. Much of this was because of the steady support of the publishers Ticknor and Fields, especially Longfellow's friend James T. Fields. William Ticknor had died in 1864, but Fields worked hard to keep Longfellow happy. There are records of him buying concert tickets on behalf of Longfellow and things like that, just to keep him happy. But then in 1871, Fields announced his retirement. And Longfellow had little faith in his successor, James R. Osgood. So Longfellow did the only logical thing. He looked elsewhere. Longfellow wrote a poem called The Hanging of the Crane and sent a copy to a friend in New York and asked him to look into publishing it with the New York Ledger, Fannie Fern's newspaper. The editor bought the poem for $4,000, the highest fee ever paid for a poem at the time. The equivalent value in the 21st century for this single poem, over $83,000. But Longfellow had been working with Ticknor and Fields for decades. He had been one of their highest selling authors. Why was he suddenly turning to a competing publisher? James Osgood must have worried what the financial impact would be on the company, not to mention his legacy as being the one that let Longfellow get away. I picture him frantically trying to come up with a way to save face. So here's what he did. Osgood asked Longfellow to stay with the company in exchange for an annuity of $4,000 for 10 years, regardless of sales, with an additional 10% royalty on new books within their first 8 months. That means that Longfellow earned a salary even if he didn't publish anything. By the last year of his life, 1882, that payment was equal to about $92,000, even if he didn't publish a thing. If he did publish things, he earned royalties for them. So I would argue, though, that this is another important thing, because this deal begins Longfellow's late period, a period which we can see a marked difference in themes and mood in his poetry. His middle period, his period of Paul Revere's Ride, Song of Hiawatha, was meant to appease his audiences with relatively safe content. For lack of a better term, that middle period was when Longfellow sold out and became a commercial poet. To be fair, though, as we have seen, this was all very purposeful on the part of Longfellow. He knew from his graduation from Bowdoin that American literature could not improve until a writer could focus solely on writing as a profession. He worked within the system to make it happen. Once he had his annuity in place, however, I have argued elsewhere that Longfellow became a bit more daring, particularly in his willingness to betray his darker personal emotions. His final 2 books in particular, Ultima Thule and In the Harbor, focus on significantly more melancholy topics. Particularly, there's an obsession with death, uncertainty for the future, or what his lasting legacy will be in the literary canon. That part is important. I would say that he begins to worry if that commercial period wasn't so good for him after all, if he would be remembered, or if he would be disdained by posterity because of these hyper-popular poems. The inherent problem with writing specifically for contemporary tastes is that preferences will change over time. But that is a paper for another day. For a quick summation, this is sort of the trajectory of Longfellow's dollar signs. A combination of the salaries he's making with his different professorships, the major litmus tests for single poems sold for a certain amount of money, for total amounts of money earned for poems for the year, and we'll get to that last figure. At his death on March 24th, 1882, Longfellow left an estate valued at $356,320 in 19th century dollars. That translates to over $8 million today. For a man that has not worked since 1854. That's 30 years of retirement. This was nearly 3 times the value of contemporary poet John Greenleaf Whittier. He left his estate valued at $134,000 when he died 10 years later. A 3-volume complete works was sold soon after Longfellow's death, printed by Houghton, Osgood and Company. That's the evolved Tickner and Fewens. Priced at $30 to $80, depending on binding, 50,000 subscriptions were obtained in the first year. All this comes from a poet who once claimed he never dealt with any other figures than figures in speech. That's all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions you have about some of these things. Right in front, yes.
So, how much do you think that the reading public realized about Longfellow's monetary worth? You know, was this, I mean, you could see the big house, but...
Sure. If you're not local and you can't see that house, I would presume that very few readers had any indication of Longfellow's situation. Longfellow presents, and I vaguely reference, he creates this persona. And that persona, and you'll agree with me, is very humble. It's very domestic. There's not a lot of showiness to it, I don't think. With the exception maybe of some of his hoity-toity poems about Europe, that might be the only indication that people have that my experience is different from the author's. It's a great question. I say that in part because I do believe that Longfellow consciously created that public persona. But other than alluding to it, I can't talk more about it right now.
Yeah, we think of the village blacksmith, I mean, maybe they thought that was kind of like Longfellow, you know,
Right.
a common man.
Well, and I agree with that. I think that's the point I've often made with that poem, is it's really about all of us as Americans. You know, this is the ideal American subject, and we happen to be a blue-collar worker, you know, just like me and the reader. And the vast majority of the readers were... In fact, there's a comment when he visits England for the last time. The Queen of England says something to the effect of, "I love your poetry and so do my servants." The kind of snarky comment only a queen could make. Any other questions? Yes?
Did you know of Longfellow actually talking about making the choices of this poem is going to be more popular, I'm going to really try to get a big audience for this, or was he always expressing himself?
That's a good question. So do we have a lot of evidence that he's consciously presenting? No, I think a lot of that is very retrospective. I'm particularly thinking about what happens to him in the late 19th century after his death into the mid-20th century, how critics began to kind of chew him up and spit him out, essentially. I've often said that Longfellow is criticized for being too cliche. I think the problem is Longfellow created those cliches. I mean, he was just so immensely popular. But I think the conscious effort of not putting in his slavery poems, for example, indicates that he's at least conscious of finding themes that won't dissuade readership. And when we talk about like the sentimental period of the fireside poets, you could argue that those other poets are more emulating Longfellow, but you can't, because William Cullen Bryant is older, much older, and had already established a lot of the sentimentality. And we've already talked about William Cullen Bryant as being one of those main figures. Longfellow may have been emulating him. I also think he's emulating N.P. Willis a lot. If you've never read N.P. Willis, don't waste your time. He's not Longfellow, that's why you don't read him today. Yes?
How would you compare his popularity today, let's say among high school students or college students, compared with Edgar Allan Poe?
Well, the difference is that Poe is still taught in schools to a much more significant degree than Longfellow ever is. And I often complain, you know, what rises to the top often is Paul Revere's Ride. And no offense to fans of that poem, I don't think it's Longfellow's best poem. It's very indicative of the kind of poet he was at the time that poem was written, and also the context of the America he was in. But beyond that, I think there are much better examples of Longfellow's writing in any of these periods that could be considered. I think people would like him a lot more, particularly younger readers. There's a great quote, however, from Dana Gioia, who years ago had been the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. His quote was something to the effect of, although we still dissuade readership of Longfellow, Longfellow is still the preferred poet among people who don't like poetry. But Poe is still, I mean, Poe is immensely popular. And I have colleagues who have written papers on the posthumous reputation of Longfellow and Poe by comparison. For those of you that haven't seen some of my other talks, Longfellow and Poe had a massive rivalry in the 1840s. And then Poe dies in 1849, so it's irrelevant anyway. But there's this trajectory where Poe is down here and Longfellow's kind of going like this, and Poe's staying here, and then all of a sudden Poe just skyrockets as Longfellow is falling very rapidly. And it's in part because contemporary tastes change. When you write to contemporary tastes, it's really hard to expect them to have longevity. So it's our fault, not Longfellow's. Let's go to Ted over here. Yes?
Yeah, is there any indication that Longfellow was a little concerned that he was living off his wife's money? Was that ever anything that he had to struggle with?
I wish I knew more to answer that. I haven't found any significant indications that Longfellow at any point is threatened by his wife's money or that he relies on his wife's money. There may be people in the room that can answer that better than me, in fact. But I did point out that in the first decade of marriage or whatever that I have references for, Longfellow was still making more money than her. So
Okay.
I think the house being purchased is extremely important, but not in the way that most people assume it is. I don't think Longfellow sat back and kind of just let the money, let his wife's money roll in. Longfellow continued working harder and harder to kind of make himself worthy of that woman, I guess. Yes, over here.
Did he seem to evaluate himself as a person according to the amount of money he made?
That's a hard question to answer too, bearing in mind that gentility and gentlemanliness of the 19th century makes it really hard to talk about money then, even harder to look back at now because there's so little reference to it. I think there are enough references to Longfellow talking about success that my interpretation of his version of success was contemporary fame that translated into monetary success. That's my interpretation, but I don't have a quote anywhere that Longfellow says, what's most important to me is money. I don't think he would have said such a thing anyway. Yeah, Nancy.
How much do you think Longfellow was influenced by the success of his father-in-law and the need to show himself
Yeah, sure.
worthy of Fanny? Because we're talking, his father-in-law is this great kind of industrial magnate, and Longfellow's a
So yeah, in a sense,
poet.
maybe Longfellow's not trying to prove himself to his wife, but as much as his father-in-law, and I would say his father too, because I think there are enough indications in Longfellow's Bowdoin years in particular, where essentially he's saying to his dad, "This is what I want to do," and his dad is sort of like, "No, you're not. No son of mine shall be a poet." I don't know. I don't know how to answer that well. But I would guess there had to have been some pressure, whether stated or not. I mean, we all seek out to impress our fathers-in-law. Did you have a question?
I did. I was thinking about illustrations, and when Longfellow retained, you call them
Stereotype plates.
plates, did that include artist illustrations, steel engravings, or what?
Depending on the edition, yeah. When he starts doing some of the collected works, the stereotype plate period is really important. The other thing I didn't mention was in doing that, he bought all the old books that were published by other people and was able to put them in the hands of Dickner and Fields. Whereas before, his previous publishers could still claim ownership of them. So now he owns all of his own collected works, which is a pretty big deal. And so he has to say, for example, when they want to do household editions of his collected works or illustrated editions of his collected works. And illustrated editions do start becoming popular in the late 1840s, 1850s, that sort of that gift book period, where there was sort of an expectation of at least a couple of illustrations. And we know that Longfellow did have some great illustrations. There's a great one for the frontispiece of Tales of the Wayside Inn, for example, which And there is, which may feature Ole Bull, the violinist. Yes, and Longfellow would have had a say over those. Interestingly enough, I think Longfellow supported illustrations when other poets did not. William Cullen Bryant, for example, hated illustrations. He thought it ruined his poetry because now his readers can't imagine for themselves, it's sort of taken away from them. And when Bryant puts out his illustrated edition, he actually says, I'll never look at it. Yes, over here.
Where were the plates kept?
They were stored at Metcalfe and Company in Cambridge. Great question, yeah.
Which is a storage company?
Well, actually, they were the ones that did the physical printing. So Ticknor and Field was the publisher, but the big machinery was oftentimes here in Cambridge at Metcalfe and Company. So if you look at some of those, if you see it on the title page, Ticknor and Field's, on the succeeding page, it may say printed by Metcalfe and Company. And actually, in his contract to buy those stereotype plates, he insists, well, I don't know if it was his insistence or if it was Metcalfe offering, but he does say storage is free at Metcalfe and Company, which is another great little minor detail in his contracts. You had a question.
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry, we'll come back to
Oh,
you.
yes, I wanted to ask, aside from the anti-slavery code, what would you recommend?
For the, for what? What do you like most?
Well, you certainly have talked about
Sure.
how some of his poetry is superior to others.
Personally, I could reread multiple times his late period, Ultima Thule and In the Harbor. Some of them aren't great, but there are some really surprising ones in there that if you read, you'll sort of wonder, is this really Longfellow? In many ways. There's one that's called The Maiden and the Weathercock, for example.
The Maiden
The Maiden and the Weathercock. And it's about a woman who's making fun of the weathercock because it's constantly changing directions and it keeps turning away. And there's this really snide sexual comment about the weathercock saying, listen lady, you're thankful that sometimes I look away. It's not subversive at all, I mean, it's very obvious. And I say that because it sort of goes against what our expectations are of Longfellow. Longfellow making a sex joke? Come on, right? That should surprise you. I also really like, there's a sonnet he wrote in that period called Possibilities. I really like that one a lot. Let's go over here, did you? Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Might it be fair to say that the Longfellow home in Maine was comparable in many ways to the Appletons here in Beacon Hill?
It's hard to really compare. They're sort of apples and oranges because by saying the Wadsworth and Longfellow families in Maine were very well-to-do and very wealthy, it's fine, but they were wealthy by Portland, Maine standards at a time when Portland, Maine isn't comparable to Cambridge. So for example, their home that's still visible in Portland, Maine was considered one of the biggest mansions of the time. It's not impressive at all, certainly compared to this house. So that's a tough comparison to make. But with that said, I think there's an important aspect of Longfellow's upbringing in that he wasn't raised in poverty like, say, Edgar Allan Poe would have been, well, after he left his foster father, and Hawthorne was raised in just depressing poverty his entire childhood and beyond. Longfellow was very lucky in that his father could afford to send him to Europe. I don't know how many other people had those opportunities. You know. And it's especially important because you could argue too, this is a time when, now I'm going off topic, when Americans are trying to determine what is our high-class society going to be. We have this British background where we have almost this caste system where you're born into royalty or titles and so forth. And in America, we don't want that. We've broken away from England. So our upper class should be based on like our intelligence, our intellectual level, our culturedness. And I think that's an important factor with all of this too. I don't know quite how, but there's something about that. All right, who am I missing over here? Who had
I want to be sure I read it. So I wanted to ask two things about his popularity. One, I know a lot of his poems were set to piano music. And so this was, you know, people played these in their homes around the piano and everything, and I don't know how, if that helps spread his work. And also the fact that his poems were printed in what would have been taught in schools as the country had more and more immigrants and everybody wanted these immigrants to become Americans.
Yeah, I think that's very important.
And so his poems were memorized and all, and so this, you know, this has to have some huge effect on how many people then
Absolutely.
buy his books.
Absolutely, there are a lot of factors in everything that you said. I like the idea of Longfellow being memorized in schools, I think, was part of this immigration period in which, okay, we've got these new Americans, let's teach them what it means to be American. So let's bring out the village blacksmith, let's bring out Hiawatha and Evangeline and Paul Revere. Like, these are the poems that I think are really helping us define what is Americanness for these people who don't have the background yet. So that's very much an important factor. The setting to music part is interesting too. Longfellow's poems were frequently set to music or translated, sometimes without his permission. And the question is, what does Longfellow think of these things? I used the example of his parodies. The Song of Hiawatha got so popular so rapidly that it was one of the most parodied poems, probably in American history. In fact, if I had the time, I would love to do a talk on Hiawatha parodies. And Shakespeare, actually James Fields writes to Longfellow, do you want me to do something about this? Do you want me to start some lawsuits? And Longfellow says, have you seen our sales? Let's take these advertisements and let them be. He calls them advertisements, which is just fascinating. Of course, he's a pretty easygoing guy, so I can't imagine him being too upset. Nancy, did you want to add anything?
Well, I was just curious, you know, you said Metcalf and Company had all the stereo plates, stereographic plates. So, do you think they were all just melted down at some point, or did Longfellow physically take them back into his possession? And if so, where are they?
It's a great question. I remember looking into that, what happened to the actual physical plates. Do they still exist? I don't know if I ever found an answer to it. So if anybody's looking for a project, because it'd be fascinating. If you're not familiar with the stereotype plates, this is the changeover from movable type, when you'd have to set every single letter one by one, one by one, one by one, and then when you're done with that page, you destroyed that entire setup and have to do a whole new page. Stereotype plates were one giant plate for an entire page, so you could very quickly print another page, even if you'd go back to that page without destroying what you've done to get there. So that, this is a huge technological change. That's a whole other paper too, but the technological advancements in printing were leaps and bounds in this period. Prior to this, when we're talking about this sort of movable type, we're talking about what Ben Franklin did. And it's still the same stuff that Gutenberg was doing with very few changes, really. Yes, Dan.
I can't resist.
You have that look in your eye.
I'm thinking about Longfellow's talent at making a deal and his persistence
Sure.
and his risk-taking and how parallel that is to his courting of Fanny. It's the
That's right.
same guy.
That's fantastic. Longfellow knows what he wants. He's willing to fight for it. I think that's fantastic. And it should give us, I think that's great because many of us are familiar with the story of Longfellow's pursuit of Fanny Appleton. I think it should add another level of our understanding of Longfellow the man. When we think of him as this, at least I had always thought of him as this very gentle, easygoing, grandfatherly figure. And you're seeing the way he contracts with these publishers, and you're thinking, wow, this guy! So I think, yeah, that's great. We're sort of seeing this other part of Longfellow, which again goes back to there's this image we have of him that I think he helped cultivate for public consumption. So I say all these things, I hope all of these things, in my mind, I'm trying to get across, these are positive aspects of Longfellow. Good for him is what we should be saying. So, yeah, you wanted to add something?
Yes. I wonder if Longfellow be able to so thrill or so professionally doing his contract. Is that something comes down his family, being a lawyer, his father was,
Sure.
and down to, is that another profession helps his business?
I think absolutely. I think there's also the factor of this sort of old-fashioned New England Yankeedom, where we were very practical people, and so we wanted very practical things. I would also add, and that's a really great point, I came across a quote in a book from 1960. I haven't verified this quote yet, but it's something to the effect of Longfellow writing to his mother, I think, saying something along the lines of, I don't want to be a lawyer. It's just too boring. I don't want to be a minister. I don't want to be a doctor, so what's left? So he really is thinking about these potential career routes, and ends up finding two ones that he was pretty good at. And yeah, I think the fact that he's good at, it's an important piece too, because I've often argued that if you're an artist, you don't necessarily have business acumen. And in Longfellow, we have both that creative talent and this very practical business sense. Good for him. Edgar Allan Poe certainly didn't have it.
Well, there was starving in Concord.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of starving in the American authorship world. Garrett's coming towards me, so he might be saying it's time to call it with. Well, I can hang around for a little bit if people want to ask further questions, but I want to thank you all for coming out.